In today's episode, we've got rabbi-beating berserker ladies, fake Hungarians, and some sadly deceased horses. It's time for your Jewish Week. Hey everyone, welcome to your Jewish Week, the podcast for everything Jewish in the week ahead. I'm Rabbi Dovey. As always, this podcast is produced by Chabad.org and dedicated to all our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. May Hashem keep them safe from all harm, and may all the hostages finally be freed to return to their families and loved ones. Before we get started today, I've got a little correction from last week's episode. I mentioned that Moshe Rabbeinu's epic 37-day-long sermon began in the year 2448. That was incorrect. One of our listeners pointed out that it was in fact 2488, 40 years later. All right, today is Sunday, the 4th of Shvat, and we are hopefully well on our way to putting winter behind us. If you're in the New York City area, the latest time to read the morning Shema this week is going to be 9:32 a.m., and Shabbat candlelighting time this Friday is going to be 5:03 p.m. As always, halachic times for your location can be found quickly and easily at Chabad.org/times. Let's start things off with this week's Torah portion, the portion of Beshalach. The Jewish people, fresh from their miraculous freedom from Egypt, are being led by God through the desert towards Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. Right off the bat, though, things are not going to be that simple. First of all, God leads them on an indirect path to avoid hostile territory, the concern being that any danger in front of them might prompt the Jews to run right back to Egypt. Secondly, God purposely has the Jews backtrack right before they get to the Red Sea. Why? So that Pharaoh's spies, who have been watching the Jews' progress, will report back that they appear to be lost, tempting Pharaoh to muster his beaten pride and make a push to reclaim them. And sure enough, as we head into Tuesday's reading, that's exactly what happens. Pharaoh convinces the Egyptians to pursue the Jewish people. The Jews see their former captors barreling down on them and get totally freaked out. Moshe, however, assures them that God will fight for them, and they need only stand quietly and watch the salvation that God will bring about. Sure enough, the sea splits and the Jewish people miraculously begin to cross on dry land. The Egyptians pour through the opening after them, but they are drowned to a man when Moshe sends the solid walls of water plummeting down on them in the beginning of Wednesday's reading. The Jews are dazzled by God's supernatural salvation, and Moshe leads them in a song of praise and thanks. In Thursday's reading, the food supply runs out, and the Jews complain to Moshe, who assures them that they will be taken care of. Sure enough, on Friday, we'll see flocks of quails blanketing the Jews' camp in the evening and a supernatural bread from the heavens falling in the morning. This bread is called mun in Hebrew, and in English, someone decided to call it manna for no apparent reason. The way I see it, if you don't know what mun means, calling it manna isn't going to help, so I'm just going to call it mun. Now, the mun looked like these little spherical crystal things, and the Jews had to collect it fresh every morning. They were not allowed to keep it from one day to the next, except on Friday when they could collect two portions, one for Friday and one for Shabbat, because mun would not fall on Shabbat. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before some troublemakers decided to test the boundaries. Once, they tried keeping some mun overnight, and on another occasion, they attempted to make it seem like mun fell on Shabbat to discredit Moshe. Both times, it didn't turn out so well for them, and they made God very upset. Shabbat, we finish off the week with some more drama. The Jews complain about a lack of water, and God directs Moshe to hit a rock with his staff. This splits the rock and turns it into a miraculous fountain that provides the Jews with plentiful water throughout their time in the desert. Soon after, the nation of Amalek cruelly and senselessly attacks the Jewish people, brutally mutilating a handful of Jews and shattering the whole nation's aura of divine invincibility. They are eventually defeated by a crack team of hand-picked warriors led by Yehoshua, Moshe's closest student, but the damage is done. As the parsha comes to a close, God warns the Jews to never forget what Amalek has done to them. Quote, God will remain at war with Amalek from generation to generation. Parshas Beshalach contains 116 verses with two memory keys this time. First up, the words Yad Emunah. This is a reference to Moshe's hands, which remained faithfully raised toward the heavens as the battle with Amalek raged, inspiring the Jews to put their faith in God. And secondly, the name Sena'ah, which comes from the book of Ezra, because that's where all the funny names come from. As always, check out the link in the show notes for more insight into this week's keys. Moving on to the Daily Tanya, on Sunday, the Alter Rebbe will pick up where he left off last week. In last Shabbat's reading, we learned how a Jew's natural love for God can be dulled by the influence of his evil inclination. On Sunday, the Alter Rebbe qualifies that a bit. Although a Jew's senses might be dulled, his connection to Hashem is eternal. That's why even the lowliest Jew will give his life rather than deny God if he's pushed against the wall, because that experience pushes beyond his senses, beyond the feelings of his animal soul, and awakens the basic connection that was hidden in the brain, the seat of the godly soul. Monday, we're going to head into new territory. Eventually, the Alter Rebbe is going to show us how to use this essential connection to fuel our service of God every day, not just in times of crisis. To get there, however, we're going to launch into a breakdown of how everything is truly one with God. We'll use the analogy of human speech to demonstrate how insignificant creation is compared to God's true essence, and how all things are truly one with God at all times, even if they seem independent and self-sufficient. Moving on to the Daily Rambam, the 3-chapter and Sefer HaMitzvos tracts are going to be kicking off the laws of Sanhedrin, the High Court. Sunday, we'll start with the basics, the structure of the various courts, the qualifications to be a judge, and the hours and days that the court hears cases. Later on in the week, we'll cover judicial mistakes, the process of reaching a verdict, and the differences between cases involving capital and corporal penalties. Towards the end of the week, we'll get started on the various punishments the court can administer and the standards of evidence that are required in order to find someone guilty. In the 1-chapter track, we're chugging along in Shar Avos HaTumah, which we started last week. We'll go over the special impurity caused by bird carcasses, insects, and bodily fluids. We'll also cover a couple rabbinically ordained impurities: the impurity of unsupervised hands, the impurity of drawn water, and the impurity of Torah scrolls. Just to give you a brief glimpse into that, you ever wondered why the Torah reader uses a little silvery hand pointer thingy when he reads the Torah instead of just pointing with his finger? Well, the rabbinic impurity of Torah scrolls has to do with that. Basically, the sages realized that people were storing their Torah scrolls next to the sanctified food which is known as truma, reasoning that both of them are holy. The problem with that is that mice attracted by the food would end up nibbling at and defiling the scrolls too. So the sages made a decree that Torah scrolls impart impurity when touched. This solved the problem, because storing the scrolls with the truma would make the truma impure, and impure truma is no use to anyone. It's thought, although it's hard to say for sure, that the Torah pointer might have originated to avoid this impurity. It's a way to follow the place without having to touch the scroll itself. As always, if you'd like to learn more about anything you just heard, or if you're interested in joining one of the daily study cycles, check out the show notes for links and resources. All right, with the weekly overview done, it's time to take it day by day. Sunday, the 4th of Shevat, we've got 3 very special yartzites. First up, the Hasidic master Reb Moshe Leib of Sasov, known as the Sasover Rebbe in the year 1807. There's a story of the Sasover Rebbe that I grew up hearing as a kid, and I'll attach a link to it in the show notes. But briefly, a poor Jewish wagon driver once met the Sasover Rebbe on a freezing cold, stormy night and gave him a ride to his home, saving his life. The Sasover wanted to bless him to show gratitude, and asked if he owned anything valuable. Anything valuable? The wagon driver asked. Maybe my horses. Excellent, says the Sasover. One will be for Purim, and the other for Pesach. The man was confused by the tzaddik's words, but the meaning became clear a few months later. The man's first horse died shortly before Purim, and his second horse followed it to the grave days before Pesach. Both times, the sale of the carcasses to a non-Jewish butcher brought in a brief flow of cash, which the wagon driver was able to use to celebrate the holidays, but obviously, a wagon driver with no horses isn't much of a wagon driver, so things weren't looking too great. Left with no choice, the wagon driver set out to wander in search of work. At the first inn he arrived at, he overheard 2 businessmen complaining about their ill-tempered local nobleman. See, this nobleman kept firing his property managers, and he was taking out his frustration on them, his tenants. The wagon driver, figuring he had nothing to lose, approached the two businessmen and offered his services as a manager. Wondrously, the nobleman took an instant shine to him, and he grew wealthy as the manager of a large country estate. But he never forgot his wagon driving days and remained charitable to his fellow Jews for the rest of his life. Moving forward in time about 3 years, we've got our next yahrzeit, Reb Avraham Kalisker. Reb Avram Kalisker was a great Rebbe and a student of the Maggid of Mezrich, which made him a colleague of the Alter Rebbe. Later in life, Reb Avraham joined a group of Hasidim and Rebbes who moved to the Holy Land, where he passed away in the city of Tveria in 1810. Our third and final yahrzeit for Sunday is a bit more recent, Rav Yisrael Abuchatzera, widely known as the Baba Sali. The Baba Sali was a Moroccan Kabbalist and sage who spent the later years of his life in the city of Netivot in South Israel. His reputation as a miracle worker is well attested to and recorded in hundreds of first-hand accounts. Check out the link in the show notes for one such story with an interesting connection to the Rebbe. The Baba Sali passed away in Netivot in the year 1984, and his resting place has since become a holy site visited by thousands every year. Moving along to Wednesday, the 7th of Shvat, we've got a halachic note, Kiddush Levana. Kiddush Levana is a short prayer praising God for creating the moon. We also ask God to end the exile and restore us to our former glory, just as the moon is reborn each month to its full brightness. Now, technically, you can say Kiddush Levana 3 days after the new sliver of moon first appears. But the custom is to wait until a full week has passed. It's also customary to say it right after Shabbat ends, which of course would be this upcoming Saturday night. But if heavy clouds or rain are forecasted then, it's often safer to do it on a weeknight rather than risk missing the deadline, which will come on the 15th of the month. We traditionally accompany Kiddush Levana with song and dance in anticipation of the coming of Mashiach, when the Jewish people, like the moon, will grow to their full brightness, never to be darkened again. In Jewish history, Wednesday marks the yahrzeit of another Hasidic Rebbe from the late 18th century, Reb David of Lelov, who passed away in the year 1814. Reb David was a student of the famous seer of Lublin, and he was known for his tremendous love for his fellow Jews. In fact, he was said to be incapable of seeing a fault in another. There's a famous story about him that illustrates this beautifully. One day, Reb David Lelever was walking down the street when a random lady, a complete stranger to him, ran over and started screaming at him and beating him. After landing a couple solid blows on the distinguished rabbi, this berserker lady suddenly realized she made a terrible mistake. Apparently, Reb David happened to resemble this lady's husband, who had run off years ago and abandoned her. It was a case of mistaken identity. She was horrified at her mistake and apologized profusely for beating the Holy Rebbe. I can only imagine she was expecting him to be furious at the way she treated him. Reb David, however, was calm and consoled her. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "You didn't beat me. You beat your husband." Now, I don't encourage beating your spouse under any circumstances, but perhaps we can learn from Reb David Lelever how to respond when someone wrongs us. Before we hit back, it's worth pausing and asking ourselves what reality the other person might be experiencing. What story are they telling themselves? Perhaps they're lashing out at a version of us that, in truth, isn't who we are at all. Friday, the 7th of Shvat, we've got a historic moment in the modern era, the completion of the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, to greet Mashiach. The Mashiach Sefer Torah, as it's commonly known, was commissioned by the previous Rebbe as a special preparation for the imminent coming of Mashiach. For various reasons, it was only completed 28 years later, in the year 1970, 20 years after the previous Rebbe's passing. Reading first-hand accounts of the event, it's clear that everyone in the room felt the intense closeness of Mashiach's coming. The Rebbe himself led the crowd in the traditional Ata Haresa and placed the crown on the newly completed Torah. Check out the show notes for links to footage of the event. Also on Friday, we've got the anniversary of the Belzer Rebbe's escape from Europe during World War II. Belz is a Hasidic dynasty founded in western Ukraine, and in the year 1944, the fourth Rebbe of Belz, Rabbi Aaron Rokeach, found his life in imminent danger from the Nazi regime. After a series of close shaves, he and several others managed to flee the inferno. The story of their escape is filled with open miracles. At one point, for example, the Rebbe and his group arrived at a particularly dangerous Hungarian border. Miraculously, a group of 4 Hungarian soldiers unexpectedly appeared and waved them through to safety. Rabbi Aaron later revealed that the soldiers were his ancestors, the Rebbes of the Belz dynasty. The anniversary of the Belzer Rebbe's miraculous escape is celebrated every year on the 7th of Shvat, both within the Belz Hasidic community and beyond. And at last, we arrive at Shabbat, the 10th of Shvat, easily one of the most significant days, well, I was going to say on the Hasidic calendar, but really on any calendar. You know, as I'm writing this podcast, I've got 3 boxes for each day: Jewish law, customs, and history. And for Shabbat, all 3 boxes are absolutely packed. So let's take it one step at a time. First of all, the Shabbat in which we read Parshas Beshalach is known as Shabbat Shira, the Shabbat of song, in reference to the joyous song of thanks that the Jews sang after the splitting of the sea, which is of course recounted in this week's reading. There's an interesting custom related to this. Our sages tell us that the birds joined in the Jewish people's song of thanks. So, in recognition of this, it's customary to put out food for the birds before Shabbat for them to enjoy as we read the Shira the next day. All right, we're just getting started. Moving on to Jewish history, we've got the yahrzeit of Rebbetzin Rivka Schneerson, the wife of the Rebbe Maharash, the 4th Rebbe of Chabad, and the mother of the 5th Rebbe, Rebbe Shalom Dov Ber, also known as the Rebbe Rashab. This, of course, makes her the grandmother of the Rebbe Rashab's son, the previous Rebbe, with whom she was very close. The previous Rebbe had a phenomenal memory and a special fondness for recording stories of Hasidim of old. A large portion of the stories he preserved, many of them hundreds of years old, were told to him by his grandmother. In fact, she was something of a mother to the entire town of Lubavitch, and Hasidim of all ages would visit her home to hear her stories and connect to the rich heritage of Hasidus. Rebbetzin Rivka passed away on the 10th of Shvat in the year 1914. 36 years later, and thousands of miles away, her grandson, the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, passed away on the very same day. A lot had changed in those 36 years. Twice, the world was set ablaze by global war. The Jewish people had been fractured, smashed, and scattered. Amidst this chaos, the previous Rebbe had stood alone and defiant. If you spend a bit of time reading up on the Schneerson family, there's one trait you notice pretty quickly: an almost otherworldly stubbornness, rooted in a fierce devotion to the truth. Now, the previous Rebbe displayed this trait in spades. He never cared how outnumbered he was, or how many voices, both friend and foe, told him his ambitions were unrealistic. He fought to keep the light of Judaism burning in war-torn Poland, in Russia under the communist regime, and, perhaps hardest of all, in the cold, indifferent streets of secular America. The previous Rebbe passed away on the 10th of Shvat, leaving the Hasidim stunned and uncertain. For the first time in Chabad history, the Rebbe had not left any sons. Who would be the next Rebbe? Who would lead the movement into the uncertain future? Exactly 1 year later, however, the answer became clear. At a gathering marking the first yahrzeit, the previous Rebbe's son-in-law, who had been extremely reluctant to become the next Rebbe, began saying a mimer, a Hasidic discourse that is traditionally said only by a Rebbe. This signaled his acceptance of the role, and indeed, ever since that day, he is known simply as the Rebbe. The Hasidim there positively exploded with ecstasy. One distinguished Hasid climbed onto a table, he was not a young man, and recited the blessing Shehecheyanu, and all present answered Amen. We have a Rebbe, they exulted. At last, we have a Rebbe. The mimer that our Rebbe said on that occasion is studied every year in honor of this day, which has become a major holiday for Hasidim and Jews everywhere. The mimer centers on the verse, Basi Legani Achosi Kala. In it, the Rebbe highlights the idea that the world is God's garden. It's an inherently good, godly place, and it's only the sins of the past that have banished his presence from its rightful home down here. Throughout over 3,000 years of Jewish history, our goal as a nation has been to bring God's presence back. And now, explained the Rebbe, we stand poised to complete that goal. We are destined to be the last generation of exile and the first generation of redemption. I can't even begin to do justice to this mimer here, so I'll just highlight one thing that I think some people tend to overlook about it, and that is the incredible optimism. I mean, think about it. The Rebbe was someone who saw the worst of humanity. He lived through 2 world wars. Nobody knew better than him how ugly the world can get. And somehow, the Rebbe is able to look at this dumpster fire of a world and say, yeah, this is God's garden. This was a beautiful place, and this will be a beautiful place. We just have to make it that way. There's a beautiful story of the previous Rebbe on this theme, and I'd like to close today's episode with it. The previous Rebbe was recounting his experience during the Nazi bombing of Warsaw. He and his family were literally running for their lives from building to building as fires raged and hundreds of people died horrible death within yards of them. In middle of describing this chaotic, heart-rending scene, the Frierdiker Rebbe remarked, "It was a beautiful sunny day." My grandfather, may he be well, pointed out to me how insane this simple sentence is. It takes a Rebbe to be literally dodging bombs, surrounded by death, and still look up at the sky and see a beautiful sunny day in God's garden. This is the way the Rebbe sees it, and it's his vision that he shares with all of us. This Shabbat, on the 10th of Shvat, as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the night when our Rebbe became our Rebbe, think about what you can do to help bring God back into his garden and finally bring about the ultimate redemption with Mashiach in the week ahead. Your Jewish Week is produced by Chabad.org, written and recorded by me, Rabbi W. Theme music by Levi Gloshav.